The man known to history as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on the 2nd of October 1869 in the town of Porbandar on the western coast of India, a region of archipelagos with a tropical climate and a town of regional significance in the British Raj. His parents were Karamchand Uttam Chand Gandhi, a local politician, the chief minister of Porbandar state, and Putlibai Gandhi, a deeply religious woman and a devoted follower of Vaishnavita Hinduism who was given to extended periods of fasting. Gandhi grew up in a devout household, although despite this, his family demonstrated great liberality, his father welcoming Jains, Muslims and Hindus of different denominations into their home, with Gandhi himself later professing that he had no fixed faith during his childhood. Indeed, Gandhi revered his mother's saint-like religious devotion and would himself later in life draw great inspiration from her example. Karamchand and Putlibai had 4 children during their marriage: Laxmidas, Ralia Behan, Karsandas and Mohandas. His mother described Mohandas as a restless child, prone to playing and exploring, and he wrote later that he suffered from a great fear of the dark as a child, as well as a paranoia of thieves, ghosts and snakes. At the age of 9, Gandhi started school in Rajkot near his home, where he studied arithmetic, geography and history. And when aged 11, Gandhi started high school in Rajkot and was considered to be an average student who didn't join in games, preferring to read and study. In May 1883, a marriage was arranged and Gandhi wedded Kasturbai Makhanji Kapadia. He was 13 and Kasturbai was 14. But the two were constrained by tradition to live apart until they were older, Gandhi later admitting that he often had lustful thoughts about her and longed to be with her. In 1885, Gandhi's father fell ill, and whilst nursing him one night, he slipped away to spend the night with his wife. When he returned, he found to his despair that his father had died, an event which shook him terribly, as he felt that he had let his father down when he had needed him most, and had failed in his duty as a son. This would be one of the events that would change Gandhi's outlook on life, and afterwards he became more dutiful and responsible to his family as well as those around him. He would go on to have 5 children with Kasturbai, but the first died a few days after birth, again leaving the couple distraught. They went on to have 4 more children, all of them boys: Harilal, Manilal, Ramdas and Devadas. In 1888, Gandhi started studying at Samal Das College in Banavaga State, which was at the time the only institution offering degrees in the area. He started there in 1887, although failed to attend and follow lectures, which led him to leaving after a single term. This would have doubtless annoyed those closest to him, as an education was a hard thing to obtain for lower middle-class Indians at the time. Following this failure, Gandhi, now age 16, resolved to travel to England to pursue a career there after being encouraged to do so by a family friend. Whilst awaiting the relevant travel papers in Bombay, modern-day Mumbai, he was warned by friends of his father not to go to England, as the Western lifestyle would tempt him and would lead him to abandoning his religion. Gandhi's mother agreed to let him leave for England, provided that he swore a vow of celibacy and promised not to touch wine or meat. This failed to please the other members of the Motbaniya caste to which he belonged, who outcasted him when he stated that he would sail for London anyway, and he left India for the first time on the 4th of September 1888. India had been under British rule, or the British Raj as it was known, since the late 1850s, but British influence in the subcontinent stretched back much further to the days of the East India Company. It had become the dominant power in the country ever since the 1700s, after the European powers had raced to control the continent and its massive resources. The French and British soon controlled the largest portions of India, with the Dutch and Portuguese also having small colonial outposts. The Europeans then fought it out to control India, but the British eventually carried all before them by the late 1700s. Whilst in London, Gandhi studied law, but struggled to impress as he was a shy young man. He then joined a public speaking practice group in order to improve his speaking technique, becoming proficient in the English language as well as in Western ways, for instance, learning the etiquette demanded of gentlemen at the dinner table. He found London to be a daunting place. He once entered a lift, thinking it was just a normal room, but panicked as the lift began to move, and after an attempt at living the life of a fashionable bachelor, Gandhi abandoned his French and dancing lessons and instead settled into a seriously dedicated and frugal lifestyle. It was at this time that Gandhi developed a passion for the study of religious works, dedicating immense periods of time to the study of the Bible and the Vedas, later reporting that, whilst the Old Testament sent him to sleep, the New Testament, and particularly the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus proclaimed that the meek and peacemakers were blessed, touched him deeply. Despite his problems and shy nature, Gandhi was called to the bar in 1891, which meant he was now qualified as a barrister, after which he slowly gained confidence as well as a small circle of friends, although before long he returned to India. He tried to start his own legal practice, but found the cross-examination of suspects and defendants difficult and resorted to returning to his hometown of Rajkot, where he earned a meagre living writing petitions, a welcome but inadequate release from the petty and uninspiring legal matters which had bothered him. Then, in 1893, a Muslim merchant offered him the chance to travel to South Africa, as a distant cousin of his had a shipping business there and needed a lawyer who could speak a number of languages. He accepted and left India once again, arriving in the spring of 1893 in South Africa. He would come to spend over 2 decades in the country, and his experiences there would transform his views on both the British Empire and human nature in general. He is remembered primarily for his works during this period, and the effect that it had on his life was profound. As soon as he arrived in South Africa, Gandhi was subjected to racial abuse and physical violence. On one occasion, he was beaten after refusing to sit on the floor of a stagecoach, not being allowed to sit with the white passengers. Another notorious incident occurred on the 7th of June 1893, when he was thrown off a train after refusing to leave the first-class cabin for which he had bought a ticket. After being ejected, Gandhi sat on the platform all night, reflecting on his treatment and that of his countrymen. He considered himself to be a British citizen and Indian second, but now began to question this. Gandhi resolved to ensure that this experience was not one from which he would run. Instead, he pledged to himself that he would make this experience the basis of a fight against racism and discrimination. The British Empire was an ideological contradiction, as Arthur Wellesley once wrote on British rule in India, "If we lose our character for truth and good faith, we have but little to stand upon in this country." This view was expanded upon later as more liberal British politicians argued that the British should educate and lift indigenous people out of their poverty and make them free and equal citizens of the empire. This was all well and good, but its success depended on the people in charge of the respective colonies, and all too often racism and oppression of native peoples and minorities became commonplace, and by far the most divided and hostile British colony for both African and Indian people was South Africa. In 1894, as Gandhi was preparing to return home, his contract over, the Natal government proposed a new law that would deny Indians the right to vote. They were a community which had become relatively numerous by this stage in the Transvaal and Natal states. Despite their numbers, the Indian minority in the state had been discriminated against regularly. They were denied the right to trade in certain areas. There were restrictions on places of residence, as well as immigration and citizenship limitations. Enraged by this new law, Gandhi decided to stay in the country and helped to establish the Natal Indian Congress, which would go on to oppose the South African government's increasingly harsh legislation against Indian rights over the coming years. Gandhi argued that any resistance to the new laws should always be non-violent, as inflicting harm on whites would do nothing but escalate the oppression and portray Indians in a negative light, as well as violating the values which underpinned his view of their religious character. Gandhi continued with his political activity and still regarded himself as a citizen of the empire rather than being against it. Indeed, this was the foundation of his argument, that Indians were citizens of the British Empire, following a royal proclamation of 1858 which confirmed this, and as such should have the same rights and freedoms as all other members of the Commonwealth. His campaign initially took the form of petitions and newspapers, leading to the eventual launch of a journal in 1903 named Indian Opinion, which worked alongside the Natal Indian Congress and the Transvaal British Indian Association, both of which helped in the coordination of Gandhi's political activities. This was borne out and later changed when, after the outbreak of the Boer War in 1900, Gandhi formed a party of stretcher-bearers called the Natal Indian Ambulance Corps. This was not only done to help the wounded, but to try to dispel the widespread notion that Hindus were not able or willing to be involved in the conflict. Fighting on behalf of the state was, to Gandhi, a clear demonstration of his citizenship. This would often involve Gandhi and his fellow stretcher-bearer carrying wounded soldiers for miles through rough terrain to field hospitals behind the British lines. And after the war had ended, Gandhi and a number of his comrades were awarded the Queen's South Africa Medal. In 1906, a new law was passed by the Transvaal government which stated that all Indian and Chinese persons had to be fingerprinted and registered with the government. The Asiatic Registration Act, also known as the Black Act, was a move which sparked massive protest amongst minority populations in the Transvaal region, manifested in bonfires of registration certificates and illegal border crossings between 1907 and 1914. Gandhi involved himself deeply in these protests and saw them as a peaceful means through which the Transvaal government could be challenged, although this led to his arrest on multiple occasions and he spent nearly 250 days in South African jail cells during this period. His actions as a spokesman for the plight of Indians in the region earned him a medal from the Indian government, the Kai Stari Hind Gold Award. Subsequently, Gandhi and his fellow Indians organized a mass protest in Johannesburg. Throughout this time, Gandhi urged Indians in South Africa to defy the new laws peacefully and suffer punishment without retaliation, especially violent punishment. He again volunteered as a stretcher-bearer when the British declared war on the Zulus, after they had rebelled, complaining of excessive taxation, and on one occasion he tried to help an injured Zulu on the battlefield, but was stopped by a British soldier. The conflict did much to change his view of the empire, as thousands of Zulus were killed during it, often being mowed down by the hundreds by the British. Given this treatment by the South African and British government of him and his fellow Indians, as well as now being confronted with the sight of native people being slaughtered by British forces, he began to wonder if his naive and idealistic view of the empire was correct. His actions, despite their scale, had done very little to change the nature of everyday life for Indians in South Africa. Gandhi's lifestyle and outlook had also dramatically changed over the period. He began to abandon the Western style which he had acquired during his time in England, and began to dress in simple outfits, washing and cutting his own hair, taking a vow of celibacy in 1906, leaving him to free himself to care for the whole of humanity as a family. Despite his growing political influence, Gandhi experienced several personal problems, particularly in relation to his family. Indeed, his relationship with his wife, Kasturbai Makanji Kapadia, was already strained, and she had threatened to leave their marriage during the time they spent in South Africa together. Gandhi remained in South Africa for almost a decade after this, establishing first the Phoenix Settlement in 1906, a farm where he could put into practice the values which he preached, namely those of self-help, dignity of labor, and simplicity. He became more involved in a second farm called Tolstoy, which was set up in 1910, where people of different races and religions could live together in harmony, according to the traditions usually seen in Hindu ashrams or temples. It was during this time that Gandhi began to shape and found his own political beliefs, writing his first major work, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, in 1909 on a return voyage from England to South Africa, and two latter works in the 1920s which marked both his political experiences in South Africa as well as an autobiographical work encompassing a greater swathe of his life. Gandhi's political thought was developed more freely in these works and centered on two key principles, Satya and Ahimsa, referring to truth and non-violence respectively, which built on an ideology already deeply rooted in Hinduism. Gandhi believed that truth was the guiding principle of human life, and that it demanded the utmost attention and devotion from any human with the desire to realize it, although he also argued that the truth was understood subjectively. However, while one could see the truth in a different way to another person, he believed, violence against another because of this prevented them from exercising their right to hold a different view of the truth. This perspective was widened to religions, which Gandhi maintained were simply different ideas exercised in the pursuit of the same truth, giving all faiths equal validity and worth to their membership. Indeed, Gandhi was inspired throughout his life by Christian ideas, such as those expressed by Jesus during his Sermon on the Mount. The defense of the interests of the weak against those of the mighty must therefore also be conducted in a non-violent manner. Such was the basis of Gandhi's insistence on non-violence, even when applied in reference to the anti-colonial struggle. This video is sponsored by Truebill, the amazing all-in-one finance solution for busy people like you. It provides an overview of your finances, lowers bills, cancels unwanted subscriptions, and helps you achieve all your financial goals in one easy-to-use app. Truebill also allows members to monitor their credit scores and build savings. But the best thing about Truebill for us is the ability to set budgets and monitor spending. With handy notifications, members can keep their finances on track with this all-in-one finance app. Plus, you can see your spend-to-earn ratio by month, quarter, or year. We love the fact that unwanted subscriptions can be easily cancelled too. Truebill identifies recurring charges and cancels unwanted subscriptions for you with just a tap. Let Truebill improve your financial health and budget like a boss. Members can lower those bills, cancel unwanted subscriptions, and set up a smart savings account. Just set your saving amount and frequency, and Truebill will do the rest. You can download Truebill for free by heading to truebill.com/thepeopleprofiles or by simply clicking on the link in the video description. In 1914, Gandhi travelled back to India with his wife via London, a stopover which coincided with the outbreak of the First World War. This period was unpleasant for Gandhi, who was plagued with illness and exhaustion from his time in South Africa, although it was one which he still put to good use, forming an Indian ambulance corps in the British capital for Indian residents to continue their program of non-violent advocacy for empowerment and recognition. Once Gandhi had returned home, he joined the Indian National Congress and travelled throughout the country in an effort to reacquaint himself with the issues the country now faced, especially those of India's poor. Upon his return to the land he considered to be his spiritual home, Gandhi was welcomed with some curiosity and confusion. His wardrobe and style was seen by many as strange and unmodern, and some remained unconvinced of his model of a rural, loosely governed country which he promoted. Jawaharlal Nehru criticized Gandhi's theories as the Mahatma's fads, and members of the Indian National Congress generally considered his actions to be a distraction from the greater task of reforming the state and ending colonial rule. In 1917, Gandhi became aware of the plight of peasants in the Champaran district of northern India. The authorities there had forced them to grow indigo, with the result that they had become short of food to eat and sell, which meant that they could not pay their rent. Gandhi led a campaign of non-violent protest and non-cooperation against the authorities, and won concessions which allowed the peasants in Champaran to once again grow their own crops. The same system of satyagraha, or peaceful protest, was used again by Gandhi in a series of movements aimed at securing the status and livelihood of farmers in the Kaira district, and in a bid to secure the wages of cotton mill workers in Ahmedabad between 1917 and 1919. Indeed, the success of local-level satyagraha had inspired Gandhi to apply the same principles on a wider scale against the colonial government, with an opportunity presenting itself at the beginning of 1919. A year earlier, Gandhi had taken part in the British-led campaign to recruit Indian soldiers to fight in World War I. This has since caused many historians to question his dedication to non-violence and is hotly debated to this day. On the 18th of March 1919, the Imperial Legislative Council in Delhi passed the Rowlatt Act, another so-called Black Act, against the unified political opinion of Indian legislatures and politicians. This extended for an indefinite period the British Raj's power to arrest and detain anyone deemed to be engaging in revolutionary or anarchical activity. The Rowlatt Act in effect had removed the controls normally applied to law enforcement agencies and authorized them to operate outside conventional judicial boundaries in response to a perceived threat of terrorism. Gandhi had been inspired by the satyagraha policy used in local protests against the order to grow indigo and wished to apply the same principle of non-violent, passive political resistance in his fight against the Black Act. Gandhi first warned the government against passing the act, which they ignored. In return, they warned him not to enter the city of Delhi or he would be arrested. Gandhi defied the order and was promptly arrested, resulting in widespread rioting throughout India. His protest failed on account of his small membership base and lack of political organization. Gandhi would later say that it was a Himalayan miscalculation to presume that the Indian population as a whole was ready for the form of protest which he had developed on a local scale. His position was further undermined by the fact that the Indian National Congress had neither sanctioned nor actively backed his program of peaceful protest. 4 days later, hundreds of Indians gathered in a park in Amritsar, despite public meetings being forbidden. A contingent of Empire troops entered the park under the command of Colonel Reginald Dyer and opened fire, killing hundreds of people, including women and children. Many people threw themselves down a well in the park to escape the hail of bullets. The Jallianwala Bagh of 1919 massacre, as it became known, severely damaged Britain's reputation in India and around the world, and did nothing but harden the resolve of Indians to gain independence. The massacre was one of the key events in weakening Britain's influence in India, and Gandhi soon began to push more than ever for India's freedom. By the autumn of 1920, Gandhi was becoming the dominant figure on the Indian political stage. He remodeled the Indian National Congress into a more effective political organization, building greater grassroots support in small towns and villages. He was determined to push for an end of the British Raj, which he had now come to call satanic, as demonstrated by their actions in the massacre of 1919. In line with his preference for non-compliance, Gandhi called for a boycott of British-made goods along with any new laws or instructions from the government, including councils, courts, offices, and schools. This campaign found widespread support across the country and raised the possibility of an end to foreign rule. It also led to the arrests of thousands of protesters who were happy to defy laws and risk imprisonment. In February 1922, the movement seemed to be riding the crest of a wave, but Gandhi called off the program of mass civil disobedience, following an outbreak of violence in the remote village of Chauri Chaura. The move came as a heavy blow to many of his followers, who feared his self-imposed restraints and scruples could render the nationalist struggle ineffective. Gandhi believed the principle of protest and non-violence was based on the premise that satyagraha was the most effective form of political protest, as well as a process through which Indians would gain moral renewal. In addition to this, Gandhi argued that the Raj was sustained solely on the imperfections of Indians, and that in order for the regime to fall, his countrymen and women simply had to withhold their support for the colonial government. Between 1920 and 1922, Gandhi led another satyagraha against the British government and was once again arrested on the 22nd of March 1922 and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was released from prison early after serving less than 2 years to undergo an appendix operation. After a period of recovery, Gandhi restarted his campaign of non-compliance. Whilst he was imprisoned, the Congress Party had split into 2 factions, one which favoured political engagement and another which opposed it. Also, divisions began to emerge between the country's Hindu and Muslim populations, which would later lead to an irrevocable split, resulting in far-reaching consequences throughout the country. Gandhi sought to heal the divisions, first by reason and persuasion, and then by undertaking a 3-week fast to re-establish the ideal of non-violent protest. By December 1924, he had been named president of the Congress Party, but was then largely regarded as a spent force for much of the 1920s. In 1927, however, the British set up a Constitutional Reform Commission, which did not contain a single Indian. Independence for India rose once again up the political agenda. At a Congress meeting in 1928, Gandhi called for India to be given dominion status on an equal footing with countries such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand within the empire. Gandhi was now back as a leading voice within the Indian National Congress. On the 1st of January 1930, Jawaharlal Nehru hoisted the flag of India in Lahore, read out a pledge of independence, and expressed a readiness to withhold taxes. This so-called Declaration of Independence was promulgated on the 26th of January 1930. Although the declaration had no legitimacy, the aim was to provoke a response from the British. On the 12th of March, Gandhi, then aged 60, set off on what was known as the Salt March, a satyagraha in opposition to the British-imposed tax on salt, which affected the poorest in the community. Gandhi walked 250 miles from Ahmedabad to Dundee on the Arabian coast, stopping off at villages along the way to whip up support and gain followers. On arrival, Gandhi picked up handfuls of salt, technically producing salt, and so breaking the law. He continued to do this for the next 2 months. Gandhi was eventually arrested, along with thousands of his followers, which only served to recruit even more to his campaign. By the end of the year, some 60,000 people had been jailed for taking part. The Salt March was instrumental in demonstrating the significance of Gandhi to the nationalist movement in India, supplying a highly popular form of peaceful protest which appealed to many in the wider population. It also worked against the British, who were roundly condemned for the use of force against unarmed and peaceful protesters. Public opinion in Britain had changed markedly since the early 20th century, and the government agreed in the early 1930s to start roundtable discussions with Indian representatives regarding reforms to the governance of India. Gandhi travelled to Britain in 1931 to attend a roundtable conference, which failed to make any substantive progress, but was seen as a public relations success for Gandhi. While in London, he stayed in the East End, then as now one of the poorest parts of London, where many people were living in conditions comparable or even worse to many Indian peasants. He also travelled to northern England, to the industrial cities, and experienced for himself the conditions British working-class people of the time lived in. He had been invited to see the hardships suffered by workers in the textile industry, which had been decimated by Gandhi's call for a boycott of British goods. Trouble had been expected, but Gandhi received a warm welcome from local workers, as they perceived his sympathies as being with the workers and not the mill owners. Gandhi's trip greatly endeared him to the hearts of the British population, and Gandhi himself was greatly touched by the warm welcome he received in Britain and the kindness of the people he met. To many in the British ruling classes, including Churchill, Gandhi was regarded as a dangerous and subversive rebel, but the majority of the British population sympathised with his mission and the suffering of Indians under the British Raj. This swell of public opinion in Britain would become one of the major factors in the British government granting independence. At this time, Germany and Japan were becoming an increasing threat to world peace, and with the outbreak of World War II, Indian troops were once again needed to help fight the Germans in North Africa and the Japanese in the Far East. Gandhi was strongly against India providing any assistance to Britain, which contrasted sharply with him aiding the recruitment of Indian troops for the British in the First World War. But his campaign was largely a failure, with nearly 2.5 million Indians volunteering to join the British Army during the conflict. However, the Second World War effectively unified the Indian National Congress in their opposition to the Raj, as many representatives were outraged that the British government was unwilling to make any constitutional changes to a land that, by virtue of its subjugation under the British, was just as at risk from attack and occupation by the Axis powers as Britain was. Gandhi's opposition to helping Britain was based on the argument that it was wrong for Indians to fight for Britain and its war to save Western liberty, when liberty and freedom was denied to Indians themselves. The great contradiction and weakness of the British Empire was that the country claimed to be a beacon of freedom and liberty, and, on the other hand, denied freedom and liberty to its citizens throughout the empire, particularly those of colour. This was the key to Gandhi's entire argument against British rule. By 1942, Japan had made gains in Southeast Asia, and Britain, America, and China were all keen to encourage India's full cooperation in the war effort. In April that year, Sir Stafford Cripps, a member of the British War Cabinet, was sent to India to discuss possible self-government for the country in all aspects other than defence, but his mission failed and further discussion was postponed till after the war. Some historians believe Cripps' mission was simply an appeasement to Chinese and American concerns about British imperialism. Gandhi seized on the failure of the mission and called for the voluntary withdrawal of the British from India, which developed into the Quit India movement. On the 8th of August 1942, he made his famous Do or Die speech in Bombay, now called Mumbai, calling for determined but passive resistance and a non-violent fight for Indian independence. Gandhi realized that this was a risky move to make. Tensions amongst the population and the colonial administration had run high since the beginning of the war, and the ever more potent threat of a Japanese invasion had increased this to new highs. Gandhi was once again arrested, along with all members of the Congress High Command, in a series of dawn raids in August 1942. 60,000 Indians were imprisoned in a crackdown on efforts to subvert the war effort. The move simply pushed support for Congress and its aims underground. In June 1945, the British Viceroy Field Marshal Lord Wavell convened a political conference in Simla in an effort to bridge the gulf that had opened up between the Congress Party and the Muslim League, led by Ali Jinnah, who wanted a separate Muslim state from the rest of the country. London's primary concern was how to build a consensus between the two sides to allow the British Raj to withdraw as expeditiously as possible. Elections were held in the winter of 1945 and early 1946, and the Muslim League won all 30 seats reserved for Muslims in the Central Legislative Council, weakening Congress's argument that it spoke for the entire population of British India. In 1946, the British government proposed creating a federal India, with large amounts of autonomy for its three parts as a means of accommodating the Muslim majorities in both the east and west of the country. Nehru, however, declared that no future parliament could be bound by such a pre-arranged plan, which Jinnah took to mean its rejection, prompting him to call on Muslims to take direct action. Thus began a bloody civil war. After the conflict broke out, Gandhi swore he would not eat until the violence stopped. Over the coming days, the violence did die down, and the fast was deemed another success, but would also damage Gandhi's health considerably. Gandhi also appeared to have doubted his own emotional and spiritual devotion at this time, and engaged in a practice of sleeping naked with his young female aides as a test of his ability to control desire and maintain his vow of celibacy. The violence which had developed between communities in India caused Gandhi much mental as well as physical strife, since it demonstrated a complete abandonment of his values of the Swaraj, which emphasized religious and social tolerance and a willingness to commune with others, regardless of their differences. Gandhi also viewed Indian national identity as separate from religion, and argued that nationhood and faith were not synonymous. He attempted to use the same tactics he had deployed in South Africa to bring the two sides together, emphasizing close cooperation and attention to the issues which affected Muslim populations. This policy was ultimately unsuccessful, due in part to the appeal of the idea of an independent Pakistan. The division between the two religions was further increased because of the violence, to a point where coexistence was largely impossible. In March 1947, Lord Mountbatten was dispatched to India to become its last viceroy, with a brief to hand over control to responsible hands by no later than 1948. Finding the situation too dangerous, he opted for partition. Gandhi alone refused to reconcile himself to the idea and urged Mountbatten to offer Jinnah the premiership of a united India, which Nehru rejected. Britain's Parliament passed the Indian Independence Act in July 1947. It ordered the dominions of India and Pakistan to be demarcated by mid-August, and the country's assets to be divided within a month. The hurried partition and the tensions between Hindus and Muslims then caused a mass migration, in which over 10 million people left their homes and crossed the borders to and from India. In the resulting violence, over 1 million people died, causing more animosity between the two religions. Gandhi's fast, perceived to be in support of Muslims, despite the violence and growing hatred of them by his fellow Hindus, enraged many people who saw Gandhi's actions as a betrayal, especially as Pakistan had started military incursions into India and Kashmir. Some pledged to kill Gandhi for his support for Pakistan and for his continuing kindness towards Muslims in general. Gandhi never allowed himself to be guarded or have a security detail. He would often appear in public with only a few close unarmed followers, which made him an easy target for any would-be assassin. Gandhi saw death not as a disaster, but rather as something which would signify the importance of his quest for truth. On the 30th of January 1948, as he was walking through the gardens of Birla House in Delhi, where he would lead daily prayer meetings, he was approached by a lone gunman, Nathuram Godse, who bowed before him and then fired 3 shots into his chest. Gandhi crumpled to the ground. His final words, "Hai Ram," signified the name of God, which he had been taught as a child. He was carried into Birla House, and a short time afterwards, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi died of his wounds. Godse had ironically held Gandhi responsible for the partition of India, despite the fact that he had worked tirelessly in the last months of his life to maintain order and unity amongst the Indian population. The next day, Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, gave a nationwide radio broadcast in which he said that the light had gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. The following morning, Gandhi's body, covered with flowers and petals, was taken from Birla House to Rajghat, where he was to be cremated in the traditional Hindu fashion. Before his cremation, many members of the Indian National Congress flocked to see the body in a show of silent mourning, joined later by Lord Mountbatten, who made sure that the religious identity of the shooter was kept a secret. Gandhi's body was carried to the Jumna River. The route was lined by over 2 million people, making it perhaps the largest funeral in history. They had gathered to watch the cremation of a man who had led millions to resist in a peaceful manner colonialism and oppression all over the world. The grief of his passing was widespread throughout the globe. Einstein said of him, "Generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth." In India, Gandhi's death had wide reverberations, and he was soon crowned the unofficial father of the new Indian nation, seen as a protagonist in the nationalist movement and a key communicator and mediator between the Indian population and colonial officials. Gandhi encouraged massive support for the nationalist movement and worked hard to try to promote his values of peaceful protest and engagement amongst an angered and tense population, although this latter aspect of his program was markedly less successful. Recent research has suggested that, in practice, very few actually shared the same ideals as Gandhi and were willing to participate in peaceful protests only when it suited their own ends, far from the values of cooperation, peace and compromise which Gandhi sought to instill in his countrymen and the nationalist movement. The British government, apart from a few who backed Gandhi, generally considered him to be a tricky lawyer with a propensity for masking nationalism in a softer, less threatening religious cloak. He did, however, gain genuine support from many members of the British public during his visit to the UK in the 1930s. The fact that Gandhi was able to advance the independence movement whilst putting himself at significant personal danger and seldom encouraging violence does pay testimony to his genuine commitment to the values he wished to make the norm. Indeed, his commitment to this form of political activism played a fundamental role in his death. Modern scholarship has been more critical of Gandhi and argued that, aside from his status as an influential nationalist, he failed to engage politically with the issues which affected the most economically disadvantaged in India. This, coupled with his profoundly outdated view of the modern state, in turn set India onto its new setting of independence, incorporating ideas impractical in administering the state. He was undoubtedly a difficult husband and father, and whilst his marriage eventually matured into a happy and committed one, tensions existed between Kasturbai Makhanji Kapadia and Gandhi for a number of years after they had been married. Gandhi's eldest son, Harilal, rebelled against his father's ideals, and his political influence brought much unwanted attention to his wider family. Gandhi, instead of being the architect of the new India, is better and more accurately remembered as a towering figure in the anti-colonial movement, an advocate for peace and cohesion in a program necessarily divisive and aggressive, a symbol of hope and a beacon for alternative practices in a rapidly changing world. What makes Gandhi so extraordinary is that in the face of oppression and violence, he rejected the impulse to fight fire with fire and chose to resist oppression with peaceful non-cooperation. What do you think of Gandhi? Were his methods groundbreaking or simply backward and ineffective? Despite his failure to encourage support for his ideology, can Gandhi still be thought of as the leader of the Indian nationalist movement? Let us know in the comment section below, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. This video is sponsored by Truebill, the amazing all-in-one finance solution for busy people like you. It provides an overview of your finances, lowers bills, cancels unwanted subscriptions, and helps you achieve all your financial goals in one easy-to-use app. Truebill also allows members to monitor their credit scores and build savings. But the best thing about Truebill for us is the ability to set budgets and monitor spending. With handy notifications, members can keep their finances on track with this all-in-one finance app. Plus, you can see your spend-to-earn ratio by month, quarter, or year. We love the fact that unwanted subscriptions can be easily cancelled too. Truebill identifies recurring charges and cancels unwanted subscriptions for you with just a tap. Let Truebill improve your financial health and budget like a boss. Members can lower those bills, cancel unwanted subscriptions, and set up a smart savings account. Just set your saving amount and frequency, and Truebill will do the rest. You can download Truebill for free by heading to truebill.com/thepeopleprofiles or by simply clicking on the link in the video description.
Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.